Chapter 2. The next thing I have to do is to present such additional information as I possess on the subject of the Moonstone, or to speak more correctly, on the subject of the Indian plot to steal the diamond. The little that I have to tell is, as I think I've already said, of some importance, nevertheless, in respect of its bearing very remarkably on events which are still to come. About a week or 10 days after Miss Verinder had left us, one of my clerks entered the private room at my office with a card in his hand, and informed me that a gentleman was below who wanted to speak to me. I looked at the card. There was a foreign name written on it, which had escaped my memory. It was followed by a line written in English at the bottom of the card, which I remember perfectly well. Recommended by Mr. Septimus Luker. The audacity of a person in Mr. Luker's position, presuming to recommend anybody to me, took me so completely by surprise that I sat silent for the moment, wondering whether my own eyes had not deceived me. The clerk, observing my bewilderment, favored me with the result of his own observation of the stranger who was waiting downstairs. "He is rather a remarkable-looking man, sir. So dark in the complexion that we all set him down in the office for an Indian, or something of that sort." Associating the clerk's idea with a line inscribed on the card in my hand, I thought it possible that the Moonstone might be at the bottom of Mr. Luker's recommendation, and of the stranger's visit at my office. To the astonishment of my clerk, I at once decided on granting an interview to the gentleman below. In justification of the highly unprofessional sacrifice to mere curiosity which I thus made, permit me to remind anybody who may read these lines that no living person, in England at any rate, can claim to have had such an intimate connection with the romance of the Indian diamond as mine has been. I was trusted with the secret of Colonel Herncastle's plan for escaping assassination. I received the Colonel's letters, periodically reporting himself a living man. I drew his will, leaving the Moonstone to Miss Verinder. I persuaded his executor to act on the chance that the jewel might prove to be a valuable acquisition to the family. And lastly, I combated Mr. Franklin Blake's scruples, and induced him to be the means of transporting the diamond to Lady Verinder's house. If anyone can claim a prescriptive right of interest in the Moonstone, and in everything connected with it, I think it is hardly to be denied that I am the man. The moment my mysterious client was shown in, I felt an inner conviction that I was in the presence of one of the three Indians, probably of the chief. He was carefully dressed in European costume, but his swarthy complexion, his long, lithe figure, and his grave and graceful politeness of manner were enough to betray his Oriental origin to any intelligent eyes that looked at him. I pointed to a chair, and begged to be informed of the nature of his business with me. After first apologizing in an excellent selection of English words for the liberty which he had taken in disturbing me, the Indian produced a small parcel, the outer covering of which was of cloth of gold. Removing this and a second wrapping of some silken fabric, he placed a little box or casket on my table, most beautifully and richly inlaid in jewels, on an ebony ground. "I have come, sir," he said, "to ask you to lend me some money, and I leave this as an assurance to you that my debt will be paid back." I pointed to his card. "And you apply to me," I rejoined, "at Mr. Luker's recommendation?" The Indian bowed. "May I ask how it is that Mr. Luker himself did not advance the money that you require?" "Mr. Luker informed me, sir, that he had no money to lend." "And so he recommended you to come to me?" The Indian in his turn pointed to the card. "It is written there," he said. Briefly answered and thoroughly to the purpose, If the Moonstone had been in my possession, this Oriental gentleman would have murdered me, I'm well aware, without a moment's hesitation. At the same time, and barring that slight drawback, I am bound to testify that he was the perfect model of a client. He might not have respected my life, but he did what none of my own countrymen had ever done, in all my experience of them. He respected my time. "I am sorry," I said, "that you should have had the trouble of coming to me. Mr. Luker is quite mistaken in sending you here. I am trusted, like other men of my profession, with money to lend, but I never lend it to strangers, and I never lend it on such a security as you have produced. Far from attempting, as other people would have done, to induce me to relax my own rules, the Indian only made me another bow, and wrapped up his box in his two coverings without a word of protest. He rose. This admirable assassin rose to go the moment I had answered him. "Will your condescension towards a stranger excuse my asking one question," he said, "before I take my leave?" I bowed on my side. "Only one question at parting? The average in my experience was 50. "Supposing, sir, it had been possible and customary for you to lend me the money," he said, "in what space of time would it have been possible and customary for me to pay it back?" "According to the usual course pursued in this country," I answered, "you would have been entitled to pay the money back, if you liked, in 1 year's time from the date at which it was first advanced to you." The Indian made me a fast bow, the lowest of all, and suddenly and softly walked out of the room. It was done in a moment, in a noiseless, supple, cat-like way, which a little startled me, I own. As soon as I was composed enough to think, I arrived at one distinct conclusion in reference to the otherwise incomprehensible visitor who had favored me with a call. His face, voice, and manner, while I was in his company, were under such perfect control that they set all scrutiny at defiance. But he had given me one chance of looking under the smooth outer surface of him, for all that. He had not shown the slightest sign of attempting to fix anything that I had said to him in his mind until I mentioned the time at which it was customary to permit the earliest repayment, on the part of a debtor, of money that had been advanced as a loan. When I gave him that piece of information, he looked me straight in the face while I was speaking, for the first time. The inference I drew from this was that he had a special purpose in asking me his last question, and a special interest in hearing my answer to it. The more carefully I reflected on what had passed between us, the more shrewdly I suspected the production of the casket, and the application for the loan of having been mere formalities designed to pave the way for the parting inquiry addressed to me. I had satisfied myself of the correctness of this conclusion, and was trying to get on a step further and penetrate the Indian's motives next, when a letter was brought to me which proved to be from no less a person than Mr. Septimus Luker himself. He asked my pardon in terms of sickening servility, and assured me that he could explain matters to my satisfaction if I would honor him by consenting to a personal interview. I made another unprofessional sacrifice to mere curiosity. I honored him by making an appointment at my office for the next day. Mr. Luker was in every respect such an inferior creature to the Indian. He was so vulgar, so ugly, so cringing, and so prosy, that he is quite unworthy of being reported at any length in these pages. The substance of what he had to tell me may be fairly stated as follows. The day before I had received the visit of the Indian, Mr. Luker had been favored with a call from that accomplished gentleman. In spite of his European disguise, Mr. Luker had instantly identified his visitor with the chief of the 3 Indians who had formerly annoyed him by loitering about his house. and who had left him no alternative but to consult a magistrate. From this startling discovery he had rushed to the conclusion, naturally enough, I own, that he must certainly be in the company of one of the three men who had blindfolded him, gagged him, and robbed him of his banker's receipt. The result was that he became quite paralyzed with terror, and that he firmly believed his last hour had come. On his side, the Indian preserved the character of a perfect stranger. He produced the little casket, and made exactly the same application which he had afterwards made to me. As the speediest way of getting rid of him, Mr. Luker had at once declared that he had no money. The Indian had thereupon asked to be informed of the best and safest person to apply to for the loan he wanted. Mr. Luker had answered that the best and safest person in such cases was usually a respectable solicitor. Asked to name some individual of that character and profession, Mr. Luker had mentioned me, for the one simple reason that in the extremity of his terror, mine was the first name which occurred to him. The perspiration was pouring off me like rain, sir, the wretched creature concluded. I didn't know what I was talking about, and I hope you'll look over it, Mr. Bruff, in consideration of my having been really and truly frightened out of my wits. I excused the fellow graciously enough. It was the readiest way of releasing myself from the sight of him. Before he left me, I detained him to make one inquiry. Had the Indian said anything noticeable at the moment of quitting Mr. Luker's house? Yes. The Indian had put precisely the same question to Mr. Luker at parting, which he had put to me, receiving, of course, the same answer as the answer which I had given him. What did it mean? Mr. Luker's explanation gave me no assistance towards solving the problem. My own unaided ingenuity, consulted next, provided quite unequal to grapple with the difficulty. I had a dinner engagement that evening, and I went upstairs in no very genial frame of mind, little suspecting that the way to my dressing-room, the way to discovery, meant, on this particular occasion, one and the same thing.